Lance, g'day, mate. How are you? Doing all right in
Great.
Colorado today?
You bet. It's great to see you, Jason. Always enjoy connecting with you.
Mm. Likewise, I'm super pumped about this conversation today. First of all, though, before we dive into the topic of soul care and the questions that I'd like to ask you, I'd like to just figure out or find out from you, what are things like currently with COVID-19 in Colorado? We're here in Australia. I'm in Brisbane. It's Friday morning. Let's see, it's the 27th of March, so it's Thursday afternoon, the 26th of March for you in 2020. What's the status right now in Colorado?
Well, as of this morning, the entire state is on lockdown, what they call shelter at home, which basically means you're only supposed to leave your house for essential items. And
Okay.
they put the city of Denver on lockdown yesterday. And originally, the orders were that you couldn't buy alcohol or marijuana. So there was a rush to every liquor store and cannabis shop in the area trying to stock up. But apparently the mayor recanted his order and said, well, apparently alcohol and marijuana are essential.
Yeah.
So he allowed people to still get it, but just they had to keep social distance while
Yeah.
they were buying it. So
That's awesome. That is hilarious, especially for places that marijuana is not as readily available or legal. That is probably a little bit mind blowing for some of us, that's for sure. But if you are going to be stuck somewhere, maybe those are the things that people really think are essential if they're going to be stuck somewhere
well,
for a
for
period
some
of time.
people, I'm sure it's part of what's going to help them get through the
Get through it.
lockdown, you know. And
Absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
my wife and I went for a walk today because exercise can be considered essential, but
Yes.
it is eerily quiet. I mean,
Yeah.
no cars on the street, nobody out on the street, no workers. It's just it's pretty well shut down.
Yeah, no, we're doing the same thing as a family. We walk in the morning, super early in the morning, and then we walk right after dinner as a family. And man, it's crazy how quiet it is, even here in Australia. Today, just to give you a quick update, what's happening in Australia, most of the states are pretty shut down. I live in Queensland, and today is actually the last day of schooling. So today will
Mm.
be the last day that kids are in school, and then they get to experience a longer what we would call Easter holiday period, which was about to start in a week or two anyway. So yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
let's dive into this conversation. We met several years ago now. I think it was 4 years ago. A mutual friend introduced us, a guy named Phil Bourne, who was pastoring in Parker at the time. I think he's now in Castle Rock pastoring.
Yep.
And he gave me your name and reached out to you. And it was, I don't know if I've ever told you this, Lance, but some really close friends of ours, they're just super close friends that they've invested so much into our lives, Clay and Krista in Colorado Springs. They actually covered the cost of some of the initial conversations that we had and meetings monthly and that kind of thing, where you really coached me on this whole idea of soul care, which you introduced me to and began my journey probably 4 years ago now. And I'm super grateful for that. So
Yeah, I didn't know that piece of the story, but that's neat to know that someone else invested in that. And,
yeah.
you know, it's been such a great friendship the last 4 years.
Yeah, well, I so appreciate it. And I'd love to, because soul care is a little bit of a popular topic right now. I feel like there's a lot of books being written about it, not
Yeah.
just in the Christian world or in the faith world, but even outside of that. I feel like there's a lot of people having conversations about it, writing about it. Could you do me a favor? Could you define kind of what you mean by soul care when you talk about soul care? How would you define it?
I think first you got to start with the word soul and what is your soul? And, you know, people who are a lot smarter and more theologically astute than me want to parse, you know, soul and spirit and emotions and will and all of that. And I'm just a pretty simple, straightforward guy. And I think you can actually make the case for this biblically that really your soul is the immaterial part of you, you
Okay.
know. And in fact, I would say it's the real you
Yeah.
because the Bible describes your body as simply the container, the house, the temporary tent that houses your soul. But your soul is the real you. And someday when we die, they're going to put our bodies in the ground. but the real us, the soul part of us, the inner life of us, it doesn't go away. And
Yeah.
so I think then the care part is, it's what does it look like to nurture and to pay attention to and to tend to my soul? And that's an ongoing thing. And again, for years, even as a pastor, I intellectually knew I had a soul,
Yeah.
but it would have never dawned on me that I should actually pay attention to my inner life. And
Yeah.
so to me, that's what I think of when I think of soul care, is really tending to the garden of your inner life.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Tending to the garden of your inner life. It really is like a garden, constantly needing weeding, constantly needing to be cared for and watered and fed. And yeah, so I love that definition. That's fantastic. Would you describe for us, Lance, some of the practices when you talk about tending? That word tending has some action to it. What
Sure.
are some of the practices that you would say that you use that helps tend to the garden of your inner life? The weeding, the feeding, the watering. What are some of those things prior to this whole coronavirus COVID-19 crisis that we're in right now? What are some of those things that you do on a regular
Well, I think
basis?
they would, many of them would sort of fall under the umbrella of what we might call spiritual disciplines or practices. But I think
Yeah.
where I've shifted drastically is I used to view those as sort of the litmus test of your spirituality, or sort of the to-do list of, being a mature Christian. And now I see them much more as something I do to stay in union and in relationship and communion with Jesus. And so I think it probably, one big headline for me is they all fall under the theme of slowing down,
Yeah.
of slowing down your soul, of slowing down your pace. It's practices like reflection. It's certainly time with God, but it's not just clicking off my quiet time, reading a chapter, moving on. In recent years, I've really tried to think about my time with the Lord more as a relational than informational.
Yeah.
I'm going to the Word to meet with a person and to develop relationship, to listen to Him, not just to click off something that's on my to-do list. I think it includes things like prayer, daily office, which Pete Scazzaro introduced both of us to that. It's kind of a way to check in with the Lord during the day. Of course, Sabbath has probably become an anchor practice for me,
Mm.
kind of a rhythm of 1 in 7, and we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But those would be some of the practices. So they're not unfamiliar to us as pastors, but man, I've just gone so much deeper in them over these last few years.
Yeah. So just to talk about those real quick, you talked a little bit about reflection. You talked about prayer, um, time in the Word that's more relational than informational, slowing down, Sabbath. Those are some I would call like pillars, foundational things that you have been practicing and diving into that you feel like are the actual practical workings out of tending to your soul.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think they are critical for every leader. They're not just for, people who live in a monastery somewhere. They're actually critical to even leading, especially in this environment right now that
Yeah.
we find ourselves in. My favorite quote I probably use in my ministry more than any other is from Parker Palmer, who said, "A leader has a special responsibility to pay attention to what's happening inside himself or herself, lest the act of leadership do more harm than good."
Wow.
And I
Let's,
think when you sit with that, that really is profound, because what
yeah.
he says is, if I don't pay attention to my interior life, and I get off track and I begin to live duplicitously, I actually run the risk of being a train wreck in my ministry. And
Mm.
we've seen that over and over again, where men and women in Christian leadership have lost their way and ended up destroying their lives as a result of it.
Yeah. So good. So important. Hey, talk to us a little bit about what you feel like are maybe the top 2 or 3 hurdles that leaders find that are hindrances to them putting some of these practices in place. Like, what are the things that you hear the most when you're talking to leaders about these practices as hurdles they have to overcome in order to put these things in place?
Yeah, and I think these are probably not unique to me, but they certainly have been my struggles. And I would say if you just kind of, again, put a headline over some of this, it's our kind of propensity to focus on doing versus being.
Yeah.
We live in a very performance-oriented, achievement, success-minded culture. And so I think there's this ambition to succeed that has been a struggle for me. And again, there's godly ambition, but the truth is a lot of times, Jason, a lot of my ambition was really about being a success, the need to be known, to be
Yeah.
viewed by my peers as someone who was a high achiever. And
Yeah.
I think when you're a leader, you have a natural bias toward action and toward getting after it and making a difference and having impact. And all that's good, but it certainly can become a hurdle when it comes to really tending to my soul, because tending to my soul is not something that's going to show up in my denominational report or my
Right.
weekend attendance necessarily.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a second one. It's just the whirlwind of ministry, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's just always so much to do, and I'm sure pastors are feeling that right now in this coronavirus environment. Like, man, I'm having to change everything about how I do ministry. And so again, when you're a leader, you sort of step into that gap, and what you unintentionally do is you kind of just neglect your soul in the process.
Yeah. That's something I wanted us to really focus in on today, Lance, is because of the COVID-19 crisis that we're currently in. I feel like it's possible that we would trade one type of busyness in ministry for a different type of busyness. So we're not gathering now on Sundays and we get
Right.
busy preparing for that, but now we're producing content online. And I'm finding actually many churches are trying to really put out more content than they ever have before. And so I can only imagine that is actually causing more busyness and more work to be done. So maybe talk to us, Lance, about current situation where we find ourselves in with the coronavirus pandemic across the globe. What are some of the changes you've been making personally, or you would suggest that we make to not lose sight of tending to our soul during this time? Or should we not be looking at changes? Should we just stay the course?
Yeah, my observation would be there are two kinds of people in the world right now. Those who are scrambling, and I would put most of the pastors who might listen to this in that category, right? We're having to figure out how to move everything online, how to do ministry decentralized, all of that. And
Yeah.
then there are people who are more like me, who really are in a season of just sort of waiting. Like,
Yeah.
my world is not scrambling, but every pastor I'm talking to is in that category of, man, just having to figure all this out. And again, I think there's an adrenaline rush when you're a leader,
Mm.
that when there's disequilibrium in the culture, you sort of like, yeah, put me in, coach, I'm ready for this.
Yes.
And so you kind of run to the battle a little bit. And
Yeah.
again, we need people like that. We need people who are decisive, who will figure out sort of the innovations that are coming with an environment like this. But for me, I would say you still got to go back to those fundamental rhythms that really keep you, sustained in this time. So I think making sure that you embrace your limits, making sure that you are present with your family,
Mm.
making sure that your Sabbath doesn't get compromised. And I realize there's a week when the ox is in the ditch and you just got to do what you have to sort of get through the week. But I'm saying, as a general principle, we need to keep those same rhythms in place, not shortcut my time with God.
Yeah.
I think a big one for me right now is I can be a little bit obsessed with the news right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to sort of unplug from my technology and put down my kind of obsession with the news is probably something that a lot of us need to change. I'd say another one is you got to make sure that you're getting adequate sleep.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you haven't, I've got a great book I just read recently called Why We Sleep,
Okay.
by a doctor. Fascinating book about kind of the science, but also what sleep does for us. And again, in crisis, our tendency is to shortcut, the amount of rest we get.
Yeah.
Maybe we cut out the exercise. I would say stick with your rhythms as much as you can, realizing you may have to fudge a little bit around the edges, but don't lose your commitment to those rhythms, because it's that old thing of, when you're on an airplane, you put the oxygen mask on yourself
Yes.
so that before you put it on the people around you, and you got to take care of yourself so that you can actually serve your church well.
Yeah, that's so good. So important for us to be reminded of that. I love the idea of keeping our rhythms,
Yeah.
but not necessarily becoming legalistic to them looking exactly the same as maybe they did prior to this COVID-19 situation we find ourselves in, but not abandoning them, even though they may look a little bit different. So important for
Yeah,
us.
I think spiritual transformation is always about habit and heart.
Yeah.
It's about
Yeah.
right heart, right motive, but it is about habit. I don't think
Yes.
most of us are tempted to be too legalistic. I
No.
think we're more tempted to just get sloppy and throw them out the window.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Hey, you mentioned something just a moment ago, Lance, about motivations and ambitions.
Yeah.
You've talked to me before in the past when we've had conversations, and you've said, Jason, you really need to spend some time finding out what is the underlying motivation of what is driving you. Can you talk to us, unpack that question a little bit more? Because I think, like you've said, many pastors, many leaders, we are driven, we are motivated, and many of us for what I would call good, noble intentions. But down deep, there may be this underlying motivation that we're not even aware of. Can you unpack that question? And then also maybe just talk a little bit about some ways that you discover what is the underlying motivation that you've practically gone through.
I think the truth is inside the heart of every pastor and Christian leader is a mixture of God motives and self motives.
Yeah.
And it's hard to always discern those. And I remember one day sort of having this epiphany in my life that some of the things that people had applauded in my life were actually things that would wreck my soul.
Mm.
And so things like, workaholism and being a hard worker is a noble thing until it becomes, drivenness, and then it begins to destroy ourselves and the people around us. And ambition for me has been one of those things that, in many ways it has served me well. But I've also realized that often beneath sort of what I would have said was a godly ambition, there were also some shadow sides to that about, again, my need to be a success and all of that played out in some not so great ways in my life. And I was smart enough to always cloak my personal ambition in God talk, so it always sounded very holy and sanctified.
Yes.
But I think beneath the surface, it wasn't always so holy and sanctified. And
Yeah.
I remember one day I had this moment, not exactly about ambition, but about drivenness. I was trying to play with my calendar and figure out how to squeeze some things in. And it was one of those moments where it's like the Holy Spirit just snuck up on me and took the spotlight off my calendar and put it on my soul and just asked me the question, so Lance, why are you so driven?
Wow.
Why are you so compulsively busy? And why do you care so much what everybody thinks about you? Like, what's that about? And that took me to a deeper internal issue. It wasn't just about calendaring and productivity. It was about a why that was deep beneath all of that. And so I think when you talk about like, how do you figure out or discern some of those things in your life? I'd say the first thing that I did that helped me with this is I actually had to learn how to get quiet and still,
Yeah.
like
Man.
to be more introspective and reflective, to pay attention to my emotions, to pay attention to the things that trigger me, and then to start to ask myself the question, like, why?
Yeah.
Why does that bother me so much? Why does that trigger me? What's really driving me to this kind of compulsiveness that I have in my actions? And and here's a great question every pastor that in Australia that would be great for them to ask.
Yeah.
And it's the question, how is God coming to me right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that question slows me down, it takes me inward, it's introspective. And I just think we have to, if we're going to really get down to some of the deeper stuff that God wants to transform in our lives, we've got to learn how to be still, to
Yeah.
sit with reflective kinds of thoughts and questions, and let God do that deeper work in us. And it's not always been fun or painless, but it's been
Yeah.
very helpful in my life.
Yeah. I don't know who first said it, Lance. I think it may have been Dallas Willard who said that silence and solitude is the most difficult practice for Western Christians
Yeah.
And maybe I'm sure centuries ago, somebody else in a monastery somewhere said
Yeah.
that same line. But man, I know for me personally, the journey that I've been on, I remember back in the day when you first introduced me to these concepts of silence and solitude. I use my watch. I have a little 2 minute, countdown thing.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I sat in silence and solitude, the first months that I began doing that, I just remember thinking 2 minutes is an eternity. Like it takes
Yeah.
forever for that alarm or that timer to go off. But I've found, Lance, that it's like a muscle that can be trained and grows. And so over time now, I actually feel like my body enjoys it and even longs for it when I haven't had that time of just silence and solitude. And that's coming from an extreme extrovert, a 7 on the Enneagram, who's like, silence and solitude, that doesn't sound like fun. Let's go do something. So,
Well, and I think you're bringing up a very important point for anybody who starts this journey needs to realize, and that is it does take time. It takes time not only to slow yourself down externally, but internally.
yeah,
And I remember when I left my role at Saddleback Church in California, and I was not in a healthy place. And I started trying to get in touch with some of these things. And I started practicing Sabbath, and I actually hated it
yeah,
because I had such a frenetic restlessness in my soul. I didn't know how to be quiet. And so it took a long time. And I often describe myself like I was a car that was in park, but the engine was running and I had my foot all the way down on the gas pedal. And so
yeah,
my RPMs internally were redlining, even though externally it may not have seemed like I was going very fast. But
yeah,
I think there is a process to learn to just slow yourself down
yeah,
internally and externally that actually leads to some greater health.
yeah. That's so good. Hey, mate, I would love it if you would just share with us a few resources that you have found super helpful, or even maybe a better question would be, if I was starting out on this journey of soul care, where I'm going to begin tending to the garden of my inner life, where would you invite someone or encourage somebody to begin the journey? Are there some resources that you think, hey, this is a great
Yeah.
place to start?
Yeah, I think a great resource that asks some really profound questions of people who are kind of driven leaders who want to grow churches would be Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. It is
Okay.
a fabulous read. It had huge impact on me early in my journey. I would also say Pete Scazzero's stuff, emotionally healthy spirituality, emotionally healthy leader. I was just reviewing his wife's book recently. It originally was titled "I Quit," and
Yeah.
I think the publishers made a huge mistake and now call it "Emotionally Healthy Woman,"
Yeah.
because every guy should read it. I'm
Yeah.
I'm not kidding you. It's an amazing read. So just buy the book and put a brown paper bag over the cover, so no one thinks you're reading a book for women. Um, but it's a great read. And then I wrote a book called Replenish that
Yeah.
and I would describe Replenish as my early sort of musings I didn't have a lot of answers, but I
Yeah.
knew I wanted a different kind of life and ministry. And so I wrote a book for guys just like me who were right in the throes of ministry, local church guys who wanted to figure out how to do ministry in a healthier way. So
Yeah.
those would be some places to start, I think.
Hey, speaking of resources, so I know, actually, I don't know, I should say, all of the things that you're currently involved with, because I know probably a snippet of some of the things that you're currently doing. Would you just give us a little bit of insight into the ministry that you lead, Replenish, which is coaching and consulting and things for churches? You also are doing some work with the Unstuck group, and you're also
Yeah.
involved with some city gospel movements, I know, down like Southern Florida, and doing some things with pastors down there. Maybe just share a little bit of, Lance, of a couple of things, what you're currently working on, but then also how people can connect with you online and find some of these resources. That'd be great.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I do coaching, consulting, life plans. I do a fair amount of speaking. I am working with a large church down in South Florida that's part of this church movement called Church United, trying to really
Yep.
rally churches together. It's really a really fascinating thing. I do some work with the Unstuck team. We're building a process based on my newest book, High Impact Teams, to try to help teams be both healthy and high performing, to
Yeah.
focus on relationships and results. And so I spent a fair amount of my time. We've been building a process that churches can engage in. So doing that. And right now I'm actually writing a next book that I would kind of describe it as Replenish for the everyday person, not
Okay.
just for church leaders, but it's
Yep.
kind of like you've got one shot at this life. How do you do it best? And
Yeah.
so still working on a title. I kind of pitched a title that the publisher rejected called
Okay.
Don't Suck at Life. So I don't know. I think it has potential, but
I think it's got some potential as
I
well.
would pick up a book that had that cover on it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
anyway, we're still figuring out the title, but it'll come out probably in a year or so. But
Okay.
I'm not much of a social media guy, Jason. So if people want to connect with me, it's probably two best ways. One, feel free to just email me directly at lance@replenish.net. And then
Okay.
the second would be to go to our website, which is nothing, spectacular, but it's just called replenish.net.
Yeah.
And you can connect into the website there, and you can also contact me that way. So
I love it. I love it. Lance, thank you so much for your time, mate. I am so grateful, not just for your time today, but your time as we continue to journey together in this relationship that God has put together. I'm super grateful for it. So thanks for being
well,
with us today.
it is an honor to do this with you, and I'm appreciative of the pastors that you work with there in Australia, those guys who serve on the front lines, down in the trenches of local church ministry. I just have such respect and love. I've spent most of my 40 years of ministry right there. And
Mm,
so anyway, I have appreciation for you guys.
no, I appreciate it. Thanks, mate.